The first thing he was aware of was the sound. Not the rhythmic, reassuring beep of the heart monitor, a sound he had come to associate with the fragile mechanics of human life, but the specific, flutter-quick tempo of her own heart. It was a frantic, panicked drumbeat against the sterile silence of the hospital room, a sound only he could hear with such agonizing clarity. It was the sound of waking from a nightmare into a reality that made no sense. Caden sat perfectly still in the uncomfortable visitor's chair, his body a study in stillness that was not quite human. For 3 days, he had not moved from this spot. For 3 days, he had listened to the slow, steady rhythm of her medically induced sleep, a counterpoint to the chaotic symphony of his own guilt. The scent of the room was a layered assault, antiseptic, bleach, the faint, cloying sweetness of wilting flowers someone had sent, and beneath it all, the coppery tang of Iris's blood, thrumming just under her skin. It was a scent he knew better than his own name, a scent that had been the anchor of his world for 2 years. Now it was just another note in the chorus of his failure. His enemies had not come for him. They were cleverer than that. To attack a king was to invite a war. To attack the woman a king loved, that was poetry. It was a quiet, intimate act of destruction. A blade slid between the ribs of his immortal existence. They had found her leaving the small bookstore she frequented, a place he had always considered safe. The memory of it played behind his eyes in a compressed, sensory-dense burst. The sudden spike of her terror in the air, a scent sharp as ozone, the shattering of glass, the way he had moved, crossing 3 city blocks in the space between one human heartbeat and the next. A blur of impossible speed, 3 seconds of real time that had stretched into an eternity of being too late. He'd found her on the rain-slicked pavement, a halo of dark hair against the concrete, her life a fading warmth against his cold hands. The men responsible were gone, but their work was done. She was alive. The doctors used that word. But the Iris he knew, the one who held 2 years of their shared life in her bright, laughing eyes, was gone. Now her eyelids flickered. The frantic drumming in her chest stuttered, then steadied into a wary, waking rhythm. Caden forced the air from his lungs in a slow, controlled stream, a mimicry of a breath he didn't need. This was the moment. He had spent 72 hours turning the choices over in his mind, each one heavier than the last. The truth was a weapon. The truth was that he was a creature of night and stillness, a king of a shadowed court whose politics were written in blood and betrayal. The truth was that loving him had painted a target on her back. The truth would bring the monsters back to her door. Her eyes opened. They were the same shade of whiskey brown he remembered, but they were vacant. They scanned the white ceiling, the IV stand, the window showing a sliver of gray, pre-dawn sky, and then they landed on him. There was no recognition, no flicker of love, or even familiarity, just the cautious, fearful appraisal of a stranger. Her voice was a dry whisper, rough from disuse. "Who are you?" The question landed in the quiet room like a door slamming shut on 2 years of his life. He could feel the weight of their history pressing in on him, the memory of their first meeting in a dusty university archive, the rainy afternoon she'd confessed she was falling for him, the night he had finally told her what he was, the impossible, terrifying trust in her eyes as she'd listened. He remembered the weight of her hand in his, the specific scent of her skin after a shower, the sound of her laughter in the cavernous quiet of his home. All of it was his to carry alone now. He could tell her. He could say, "I am Caden. I am the man you promised forever to, even when you knew my forever was so much longer than yours. I am the reason you are lying in this bed." Instead, the lie he had been rehearsing for 3 days formed on his tongue, tasting of ash and self-loathing. He leaned forward, careful to keep his movements slow, human. He pitched his voice to a register of gentle concern, a tone he hadn't used in a century. "My name is Caden," he said, the words precise and empty. "I'm a friend." She woke up in pieces. Her life, the doctors explained, was a book with the last 2 years of pages torn out. The memories weren't gone, they said, just misplaced. traumatic amnesia. A filing cabinet knocked over in the dark, its contents scattered. The mind's self-defense mechanism. It was all clinical and calm, offered in soothing tones that did nothing to soothe the sheer, disorienting panic of looking at your own hands and not knowing what they'd held yesterday. There were flashes, slivers of sensation without context, the scent of old paper and rain, the feeling of a hand, larger and colder than her own, holding hers, the echo of a low laugh that made her feel safe. These were ghosts in her own head, and they were terrifying. And then there was Caden. He was a constant in the disorienting landscape of her hospital stay. He was there when she woke, holding a cup of tea he seemed to know she liked chamomile, one sugar steeped too long, and he was there in the evenings, reading aloud to her from a worn book of poetry until her eyelids grew heavy. He was, as he'd said, a friend, a ridiculously good friend. But Iris had been a doctoral student in history before the amnesia, and if that experience had taught her anything, it was that the official narrative was almost never the real one. She started cataloging inconsistencies, the way she would catalog footnotes in a primary source, and the list grew alarming fast. Inconsistency 1. Temperature. The man ran cold. Not cool to the touch, the way some people did in air-conditioned rooms. Cold. The first time he'd helped her sit up, his hand had brushed her arm, and the lack of warmth was a shock, like touching marble in a cathedral. She'd flinched, and a flicker of something pain, regret, something she couldn't name had crossed his face before being instantly suppressed. Sorry, he'd murmured. Poor circulation. Iris filed this under medical and moved on. Inconsistency 2. He never ate. She watched him over 2 days of hospital visits, during which he brought her meals, fussed over her nutrition, and did not consume so much as a cracker. When she pointed this out, he looked momentarily startled, like a student caught skipping a footnote, and said he'd eaten before he came. Inconsistency 3. The stillness. Normal people fidgeted. They shifted weight, cracked knuckles, checked phones. Caden sat in a visitor's chair like it was a throne, and he had been practicing for centuries. He was a statue that had learned to pretend at life. She was building a working theory. Current frontrunner. Caden was in some kind of witness protection program with an unusually generous relocation budget. Her friends, people she was re-meeting for the first time, spoke of Caden with a kind of respectful distance that did nothing to clarify matters. Oh, Caden, her friend Lena had said, her brow furrowed, stirring her coffee with unnecessary vigor. He's intense, but he adores you. We were all so surprised when you two got together. You brought out a different side of him. Got together? Iris had repeated, her pulse giving a nervous stutter. He said we were friends. Lena's eyes had widened for a fraction of a second before she'd schooled her features with all the subtlety of a person who had never successfully lied in her life. Right. Friends. Of course. Good friends. She took a very large sip of coffee. The lie was clumsy, obvious, and it planted a seed of deep unease in Iris's chest. Everyone was handling her with care, but Caden's care felt different. It felt like containment. She updated her theory. Witness protection was out. New frontrunner. Recovering addict with control issues and a very understanding support network. The not eating could be gastrointestinal. The cold could be circulatory. The stillness could be meditative discipline. The intensity could be transference. It was a tidy theory. She almost believed it. The day she was discharged, he was there. He drove her home to an apartment that was supposed to be hers, and walking through the door was another exercise in alienation. The furniture was hers, supposedly. The books on the shelves, the mugs in the kitchen, the worn quilt on the bed, but nothing sparked recognition. It was like walking onto a meticulously crafted movie set of a life she'd never lived. Caden moved through the space with a quiet familiarity that grated on her nerves. He knew which floorboard creaked. He knew where she kept the extra blankets. He went to the kitchen and pulled her favorite mug, a chipped ceramic thing with a painted fox from the cupboard, without hesitation. He set it on the counter. Tea? She stared at the mug, then at him. He stood in the frame of her kitchen, a tall, dark shape against the afternoon light pouring through the window. He looked like he belonged there, more than she did. "How did you know that was my favorite?" she asked, her voice small. A pause. The silence stretched, loaded with things she couldn't reach. He looked down at the mug, and something behind his eyes shifted a crack in the composure. There and gone. "You used it all the time," he said, his voice a low murmur. "I guess I just remembered." It was a simple answer, a logical one, but it didn't feel simple. Nothing about him did. He was a stranger who knew the intimate details of her life, a friend whose eyes held the weight of a husband's grief. He was the safest and most dangerous thing in her world, and she was beginning to suspect that the book of her life wasn't just missing pages. She was beginning to suspect that someone had torn them out on purpose. She revised her theory again. Recovering addict was out. New frontrunner, cult leader. Hear her out. The devoted followers, the late-night hours, the controlled environment, the way everyone around him seemed to operate on a slightly different frequency, deferential and watchful. The sheer volume of resources at his disposal, despite a vaguely described job in investments. He was either running a very successful hedge fund or a very successful commune, and the difference between those two things was smaller than most people realized. Caden called it operation, re-courtship in the privacy of his own mind, and the gallows humor was the only thing keeping him from shattering. Every day was a masterclass in self-torture. He was discovering her all over again, a woman he already knew down to the bone. He had to feign surprise at her love for obscure documentaries, pretend he didn't know she took her coffee with oat milk and a dash of cinnamon, and act as if the sound of her laugh was a new and delightful discovery, not the sound that had been the singular music of his last 2 years. The problem was that Iris made him stupid. 400 years of discipline, of maintaining a flawless human facade across continents and centuries, and this one woman with her whiskey brown eyes and her relentless questions turned him into an amateur. At a restaurant, she ordered for both of them. "You clearly don't know what you want, so I'm deciding," and he found himself staring at a plate of pasta carbonara with the quiet horror of a man who had not digested solid food since the fall of the Ottoman Empire. He moved the pasta around his plate with careful deliberation, constructed a small mound that looked like progress, and then excused himself to the bathroom where he stood in front of the mirror which showed his reflection just fine. Thank you. That particular myth was nonsense and considered his options. When he returned, his plate was gone. Iris was watching him with the expression of a woman compiling evidence. "The waiter took it," she said. "You didn't eat any of it. I had a late lunch. You said that yesterday. And the day before that. I eat at unusual hours." "Caden," she set her fork down. "You are either the world's most committed intermittent faster, or you have a medical condition you're not telling me about." He managed a smile that felt like it was made of glass. Bit of both, probably. She didn't push, but the look in her eyes said she was filing it away in whatever internal archive she was building, and that the file was getting thick. The second date was a bookstore, his idea, and it was a tactical error on his part. Iris watched him move through the stacks with the unconscious ease of a man who had been in this particular shop many, many times. He went straight to the history section without looking at the signs. He pulled a volume from a shelf, a translation of Venetian court records, and handed it to her without checking the spine. "You'll like this one," he said. "The translator captures the pettiness of Venetian bureaucracy perfectly." "Have you read it?" A fractional pause. "A review. Somewhere." She opened to a random page and found a margin note in faded pencil. The handwriting was precise, elegant, and familiar. She looked up at him. "This is your handwriting," she said. Another pause, longer this time. She could practically see the machinery of his cover story, grinding, searching for a gear that would fit. "I must have lent it to them," he said finally, which was not a good lie, because the book was priced and shelved and clearly for sale, and the margin note was in Italian. "You write notes in Italian. I studied abroad, in the 16th century, apparently, based on this vocabulary." He took the book gently from her hands, and returned it to the shelf with the care of a man diffusing an explosive. "Perhaps a different section," he suggested. Iris let him redirect, but she filed it away. Fluent in archaic Italian, owns books he claims not to own, moves through spaces like he's memorized them across decades. The cult theory was getting stronger by the day. A very old, very well-funded cult with excellent taste in literature. Later, walking home, he started a sentence with, "When I was in Vienna," and then stopped, mid-word, as if someone had pulled his plug from the wall. "When you were in Vienna?" Iris prompted. "When I was watching a documentary about Vienna," he corrected, with the smooth desperation of a man who had just stepped on a conversational landmine. "A documentary about architecture. Austrian architecture. Very interesting." "Caden, you just said 'when I was in Vienna,' with the casual familiarity of someone describing last weekend. Have you been to Vienna?" "Once. Briefly. For a conference." She didn't push. She was learning that not pushing yielded more information than pushing, because when she let the silences stretch, he would sometimes fill them with fragments of truth, a reference to a building that hadn't existed in a century, a casual mention of a historical event described with the specificity of a witness, a look on his face when she mentioned aging that was less empathy and more something she couldn't quite name. The first real crack in his cover came on a Tuesday night. They were walking by the river, the city lights glittering on the dark water. The air was cool, and she was tucked under his arm, his unnatural cold, a familiar comfort now she'd stopped flinching weeks ago, and started leaning in, which was worse, because it meant she was adapting to the wrongness of him. They were talking about nothing, a film she'd seen, a book he was reading when it happened. Two men rounded a corner ahead of them. Caden's senses registered them before his eyes did. Accelerated heartbeats, the sharp chemical scent of adrenaline, the metallic tang of a concealed blade. Not Valerius's people, just ordinary human predators who had picked the wrong stretch of river. He went rigid, not a subtle tensing, an absolute, instantaneous cessation of all movement. One moment he was a warm presence beside her, the next he was something carved from stone. The arm around her shoulder became a band of iron. "Caden!" she began, but the air between them had changed. One of the men looked up, a slow, ugly smile spreading across his face. "Well, well, look what we have here." Before she could process what was happening, Caden moved. He simply shifted his body, a small, economical movement that placed him between her and the men. He didn't speak. He just watched them. And the stillness that she'd found unnerving in hospital waiting rooms was now something entirely different. It was the stillness of something at the top of the food chain that had stopped pretending to be lower on it. The man's smile collapsed. He looked at Caden, truly looked at him, and whatever he saw there drained the color from his face. His companion muttered something urgent, and they turned and walked away with the hurried pace of people who had just realized they were not, in fact, the most dangerous thing on this stretch of river. The entire encounter lasted less than 10 seconds. "What was that?" Iris asked. Her pulse was hammering. "Just a couple of drunks," Caden said, his voice carefully neutral. "Nothing to worry about." "They weren't drunk. They were afraid of you." She pulled back so she could see his face. "Why were they afraid of you?" He looked away, out at the water. "I have one of those faces." "No," she said, her voice gaining an edge. "You don't. You have the face of someone who volunteers at a literacy charity. What you had just now was the face of something those men recognized on a level they couldn't explain, and it scared them enough to run." She paused. "What are you?" The question hung between them like a held breath. He met her eyes, and the sadness she'd glimpsed in hospital corridors was back, deeper than before, a well with no visible bottom. "Iris," he said, his voice low and pained. "Please, just let it go." She wanted to. She wanted to lean back into the circle of his arm and pretend the world made sense, but she couldn't. It was like seeing a mask slip for a fraction of a second, revealing something monstrous and beautiful and terrifying beneath. The man she was falling in love with was hiding something fundamental, and her theories, the witness protection, the addiction, the cult, were starting to feel like children's stories she'd been telling herself to avoid the darker fairy tale underneath. The need to know became a quiet obsession. Her own life was now the archive she needed to excavate, and Iris approached it with the meticulous discipline of a woman who had spent years reconstructing narratives from fragments. She started in her own apartment, going through every box, every drawer. Most of it yielded nothing: clothes she didn't remember buying, books with no notes in the margins, kitchen gadgets she had no idea how to use. It was a life without fingerprints. Then she found the box. It was a simple cardboard thing tucked away on the highest shelf of her closet, behind a stack of old sweaters. It was heavy. She set it on her bed, the scent of dust and old paper filling the air. Her heart began to beat a little faster. The first thing she saw was a stack of photographs, held together with a rubber band. She slid it off. The top photo was of her and Caden, standing on a beach at night. The moon was a bright disk behind them. She was laughing, her head thrown back, and he was looking at her. Not at the camera, at her. And the look on his face was not the look of a friend. It was a look of absolute soul-deep adoration, so naked and vulnerable it stole the air from her lungs. She flipped through the others, Caden and her in what looked like his apartment, slow dancing in the middle of a vast, empty living room. Her, asleep on his couch, a book fallen onto her chest, and him watching her from an armchair with a tender, unguarded smile. Dozens of them. 2 years of a life she couldn't remember, captured in stolen moments. In every single one, he was looking at her. Beneath the photos was a velvet box, ring-sized, dark blue, the velvet worn smooth in places. Her hands trembled as she opened it. The ring wasn't a modern diamond. It was an antique, a deep blue sapphire, cut in a way she'd never seen, set in a delicate band of what looked like platinum or white gold. It was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. She slipped it out and slid it onto the ring finger of her left hand. It fit perfectly. A wave of dizziness washed over her, a feeling of rightness, of completion, so intense it was painful. She stared at the ring on her finger, the deep blue of the stone like a fragment of a midnight sky. An engagement ring. This was an engagement ring. Her hands shaking, she put the ring back in its box and set it aside. At the bottom of the box were letters, dozens of them, tied with a silk ribbon. The handwriting was unmistakable, Caden's, precise and elegant, with the slightly archaic slant she'd noticed when he wrote down his number at the hospital. She untied the ribbon. The first letter was dated almost 2 years ago. "My Iris," it began. "I saw you in the archive today. You were so lost in that 16th century manuscript, you had a smudge of dust on your nose. I have seen scholars pore over texts for lifetimes, but I have never seen anyone look so alive amongst the dead. I have spent centuries learning to be invisible. For the first time, I desperately wished to be seen." Her breath hitched. She picked up another. "You asked me tonight what I was afraid of. I couldn't answer you. The truth is, I had forgotten what fear felt like until I met you. Now, it is my constant companion. It is the fear of a world without the sound of your laugh. It is the fear of my own nature. It is the fear that you will one day see me for what I am and turn away." She read on, her hands trembling, tears blurring the elegant script. They were love letters, passionate, poetic, desperate love letters that chronicled their entire relationship. The first date she couldn't remember, the first kiss. The night he had told her his secret, the letter was vague here, referring only to the truth of me, the long, cold years, the hunger I live with, and her reaction. "You did not run. You listened. You looked at me, and you did not see a monster. You saw me. You stayed. In 400 years, no one has ever stayed." Near the bottom of the stack, a letter in a different tone. More raw, less composed, the handwriting slightly unsteady. "You told me tonight that you've made your decision. About the turning. I asked you if you were sure, if you understood what it meant, the pain of the change, the sun becoming something you could only love from a distance, food losing all meaning beyond blood, your human body dying to become something else entirely." You looked at me with those impossible eyes and said you'd spent 3 months thinking about it, that it was the hardest decision you'd ever made, that you were terrified, and then you said yes. You said the fear didn't change the answer. You said you'd rather have forever with me in the dark than a single lifetime in the sunlight without me. I don't have the language for what that did to me, Iris. I have spoken 6 languages fluently, and none of them have a word for what you are to me. The final letter was from 2 months before her attack. You said yes. You held my hand, looked at the ring that has waited a century for a hand worthy of wearing it, and you said yes. You promised your short, brilliant, precious lifetime to my endless, shadowed one. I don't know what I did to deserve a gift like you, Iris. I only know I will spend the rest of my existence trying to be worthy of it. She set the letter down with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. The photographs, the ring, the letters, the turning. She had agreed to become what he was. She had agreed to die to who she was and be remade into something else. Something that hungered and didn't age and lived in the dark. She had made that choice the hardest choice of her life, and he had looked into her blank, amnesiac eyes and said, "I'm a friend." The rage came then, cold and sharp, cutting through everything else. Every gentle touch, every concerned question, every shared smile over the past weeks was a performance. He had sat by her hospital bed and lied. He had recorded her like a stranger while carrying the entire architecture of their life in his hands. He hadn't just hidden a relationship. He had hidden her own choice, the bravest thing she had apparently ever done. She grabbed her phone, found his name, pressed call. He answered on the first ring. "Iris, is everything all right? I need you to come over," she said, her voice tight and unrecognizable. "Now." She stood in the middle of her living room with the evidence of their past life spread across the coffee table like an indictment. The box, the photos, the letters, the ring. She waited. She heard him before the door opened, not a knock, but a quiet presence, as if he had simply materialized on her doorstep. A key turned in the lock. Of course he had a key. Caden stepped inside and took in the scene at a glance, her rigid posture, her tear-streaked face, the damning artifacts on the table, the color, what little of it he had, drained from his face. The mask of the gentle, concerned friend dissolved, and what was left was the ancient, weary being he actually was. He closed the door softly behind him. "Iris," he began, his voice rough. "Don't." She cut him off, her voice shaking with a fury she didn't know she possessed. She pointed at the coffee table. "You weren't just a friend." It wasn't a question. He looked from the scattered evidence of their love to her face, and his own was a landscape of anguish. He didn't try to deny it. He simply gave a slow, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "No," he said, barely a whisper. "I wasn't." The quiet admission was worse than any denial. It confirmed everything. The intimacy she'd felt wasn't a new crush. It was a memory her body held. The feeling of safety was a ghost of a life she'd actually lived. And the man who had created all of it was a liar. "The attack," she said, the words cold and brittle. "The reason I can't remember anything, it was because of you, wasn't it?" He flinched as if she'd struck him. He stood by the door, not daring to come closer, looking like a king brought to his knees. "Yes," he said. The word was a confession and a sentence, delivered simultaneously. "And the turning." Her voice cracked on the word, because even saying it felt insane, the turning, as if she lived in a world where that sentence made sense. "I agreed to become what you are. I made the hardest decision of my entire life, and you erased it." The grief in his eyes was total now, a vast black ocean. "I thought I was protecting you. You were protecting yourself." She walked to the door and pulled it open. "Get out. Iris, please, let me explain." "Explain what? Which lie? The one where we were friends? Or the one where my entire future was a choice you decided I couldn't handle remembering?" She could hear her own voice rising, cracking, and she didn't care. "Did you enjoy it, Caden? Watching me fall for you all over again, knowing I'd already chosen to give up the sun for you?" "No," he said, his voice wrecked. It was the worst thing I have ever done, and I have done terrible things. Good, she said, the word a shard of ice. Get out, and don't come back. He stood there for a long moment, stripped bare. Then he walked out. The door closed behind him, with a soft, final click. She slid the chain lock into place, leaned her forehead against the cool wood of the door, and screamed. The 2 months that followed were an exercise in the unique agony of immortal time. Caden honored her request. He did not call. He did not go to her apartment. He did not allow himself the indulgence of watching her from the shadows, a habit he'd honed over centuries of lonely observation. Her demand for space was the first honest thing between them since she had woken up in that hospital, and he would respect it, even if the silence was hollowing him out from the inside. His grovel was this, his absence. Every sunrise was a failure. Another day he hadn't earned the right to speak to her. Every sunset was a torment, the long, empty hours of the night stretching before him like a corridor with no doors. He threw himself into the work he had neglected. The attack on Iris had been a message from Valerius, an old and ambitious rival who saw Caden's attachment to a mortal as a festering weakness. Valerius ruled his territory with a philosophy of fear and expansion, viewing humans as cattle to be managed. He believed Caden's integrationist approach was a sign of decay, and the attack was meant to prove that Caden could not protect what was his. Caden's response was not fire and steel. It was colder, more precise. He dismantled Valerius's power structure piece by piece with the quiet, ruthless efficiency of a master strategist. He disrupted financial networks. He turned allies into informants. He found the 2 men who had attacked Iris, and he did not kill them. He did something worse. He bound them to his court under covenant law, the ancient compulsion that no vampire could resist from a king whose blood was older. They would serve as a permanent, living reminder of the price of crossing him. One evening, Kale appeared at his penthouse. His second-in-command did not use the door he materialized from the shadows of the terrace like a wisp of acerbic smoke. Kale was older than Caden by a century, his face a mask of elegant cynicism. He'd watched empires rise and fall and had lost faith in all of them. His only loyalty was to Caden, and it was a loyalty expressed almost entirely through brutal honesty and unsolicited opinions. "You look terrible," Kale announced, settling into a chair as if he'd been invited. "Which is saying something, because we don't age. Did you come here to critique my appearance, or is there a point?" "Valerius has requested a parley. He is, to use the modern parlance, cooked." Kale examined his cufflinks with the attention of a man who had been selecting cufflinks for 5 centuries. "You've won, decisively. The court is impressed. Now stop moping in this monument to interior design and act like a king." "I'm not moping. You repainted the guest room at 3 a.m. last Tuesday. That is the behavioral profile of a man who is either moping or having a breakdown, and I'm generously assuming the former." Caden turned from the window. "I made a catastrophic mistake, Kale." "Yes, you lied to the one person who specifically loved you because you didn't lie. The irony is not lost on anyone in the court, I assure you." Kale's voice softened, marginally. "She is not a creature to be managed, Caden. She never was. The woman you fell in love with looked into the abyss of what you are, spent 3 months wrestling with the decision to join you in it, and chose you anyway. And your response to her forgetting that choice was to make the choice for her. You didn't protect her. You insulted her." "I know," Caden said, the words ground out of him. "Then know this as well. When she finds out, and she has already found out, if my sources are correct, because she is considerably cleverer than you, she will not thank you for your protection. She will despise you for your cowardice." Kale stood. "You are the king. Stop buying coffee and pretending to have a pulse. It doesn't suit you." He left the way he'd come silently, leaving Caden alone with the city lights and the crushing weight of knowing Kale was right about every single word. 3 weeks into the separation, Caden almost broke. It was a Thursday, and he was standing on a rooftop 6 blocks from her apartment, close enough to hear her heartbeat if he focused that steady, precious rhythm that had been the metronome of his existence. He wasn't watching her. He was simply existing in her proximity, the way a planet exists in the gravity of its sun, even when the sun has no idea it's there. He could hear her moving inside, the creak of floorboards, the kettle boiling. The sound of pages turning. She was reading again, which meant she was healing, which meant the woman he loved was rebuilding a life that did not include him. His phone was in his hand, her number on the screen, one press. That was all it would take. He stood there for 11 minutes. Then he put the phone away, stepped back from the edge, and disappeared into the dark. He walked for hours afterward, through streets that had been farmland when he was turned, past buildings he'd watched being constructed and demolished and constructed again. The city was a palimpsest of his own history, layer upon layer of lives he'd outlived, and somewhere in the middle of it, a woman he loved was making tea and reading and being alive without him. And the simple, devastating normalcy of that was harder to bear than any enemy he'd ever faced. Cale found him at dawn, sitting on the steps of a church that had been old when Caden was young. His second-in-command sat down beside him without comment, which was unusual enough to be alarming. "You didn't call her," Cale said. "It wasn't a question." "No." "Good." A pause. "That may be the first intelligent decision you've made in this entire debacle. Your support is, as always, overwhelming. I don't support you, Caden. I keep you from making decisions that embarrass me by association." But there was something softer in his voice than the words warranted, and they sat in silence as the sky lightened and the city woke around them. Two ancient creatures on the steps of a building that was still younger than both of them. For Iris, the 2 months were a crucible. The first week was pure, incandescent rage. She packed the box away and shoved it into the depths of her closet. She raged at his betrayal, at the sheer arrogance of a man, a creature who had decided that the appropriate response to her losing her memory was to also lose the truth. The second week, the rage cooled into a profound, aching grief. She grieved for the woman in the photographs, the one with the bright, fearless laugh. She grieved for the relationship she couldn't remember, but whose absence was a hollow space in her chest that nothing seemed to fill. She would find herself reaching for her phone to tell Caden about something she'd seen, a ridiculous documentary about competitive dog grooming, the kind of thing she instinctively knew he would find baffling and endearing, and then remember that he was the wound, not the bandage. The body memory was the cruelest part. Her hands remembered the shape of his before her mind could intervene. She would reach for a cold surface, the railing of her fire escape, a glass of ice water, and for a fraction of a second, expect it to feel like his skin. She caught herself pressing her ear against her own wrist one evening, listening to her pulse, and realized she was checking for the absence she associated with him. She had a heartbeat. He didn't. And somehow, in the space of a few weeks, his silence had become more familiar to her than her own rhythm. She considered the possibility that she was losing her mind. Then she considered the possibility that she was a woman who had fallen in love with a vampire, been attacked by his enemies, lost 2 years of memories, discovered an engagement ring and a letter about becoming an immortal creature, and was now sitting on her kitchen floor at 2 a.m. eating cereal and wondering if losing her mind was even a meaningful category anymore. The cereal was stale. She ate it anyway. Some problems didn't have vampire solutions. She went back to the university archives, hoping the familiar scent of old paper and leather would ground her, but his ghost was everywhere. She could almost see him standing in the shadows between the stacks. And the line from his letter, "I have never seen anyone look so alive," amongst the dead would surface without warning, and she would have to leave. One afternoon, she found herself in the bookstore, the one where she'd been attacked, though she didn't remember that. She found herself in the history section, reaching for a volume of Venetian court records, as if her hand knew the shelf better than her mind did. She opened it. There, in the margin of a page about a 16th century trade dispute, was a note in precise, elegant handwriting. His handwriting. the one from the letters. The note read, "This is wrong. The ambassador was recalled in March, not April. I was there." She stared at the words for a long time. I was there. It could be a joke. It could be an academic shorthand for, "I've studied this extensively." Or it could be exactly what it appeared to be, a correction from someone who had been present for a 500-year-old diplomatic incident. She closed the book, put it back on the shelf, and walked home in the rain, thinking about a man who wrote margin notes in Italian and moved through the dark like he owned it. By the end of the first month, she pulled the box out again. She spread the photographs across her bed and studied the woman who was supposedly her, so happy and confident and utterly in love. That woman had known everything, the cold skin, the hunger, the centuries, the court politics written in blood, and she had chosen him. More than that, she had chosen to become what he was. She had weighed sunlight and food and the natural arc of a human life against an eternity with him, and she had picked the eternity. And Iris, with no memory of any of it, had fallen for him again anyway. Her body had recognized him before her mind caught up. Her heart had made the same choice twice. The turning letter haunted her most, not because of what it revealed about Caden, but because of what it revealed about her. She had been someone brave enough to choose the dark. Someone who looked at a 400-year-old predator and said, "I want to be what you are." Not despite the horror of it, but because the love was bigger than the horror. That woman was somewhere inside her, buried under 2 years of missing context, and Iris wanted to meet her. She called Lena. They met at a cafe she knew Caden would never visit during the day, because apparently that was a sentence that made sense in her life now. "He lied," Iris said, staring into her cup. "He told me he was just a friend, but we were engaged. He hid our entire past from me, thinking he was protecting me from something." Lena stirred her latte with unnecessary focus. "Okay, that's a big lie. A stupid one. What was he protecting you from?" "His world. It's complicated, dangerous." "So he lied for a stupid reason, but it wasn't a malicious one," Lena surmised. "He wasn't trying to hurt you. He was trying, in his own misguided, idiotic way, to keep you safe." She leaned forward. "The question isn't whether the lie was wrong. It was. The question is, can you live with the reason for it? And more importantly, do you still love the idiot who told it?" The answer was immediate and terrifying. Yes. She loved the Caden who brought her tea and read poetry in his low, midnight voice. She was starting to love the Caden from the letters, the ancient, lonely poet who had been terrified of his own capacity for love. The two were the same man. Her own mind had fallen in love with him without any knowledge of their past. Her body had remembered him. Her heart had recognized him on a level deeper than memory. She had fallen in love with him twice. She made the call on a Wednesday evening, sitting cross-legged on her bed with the sapphire ring in her palm. Her thumb hovered over his name. Her heart was a riot in her chest. He answered before the second ring, which told her everything she needed to know about how he'd been spending his evenings. Iris. Her name in his mouth was a prayer and a question. "I fell in love with you twice, Caden." Silence on the other end, then a sound she had never heard from him, something between a breath and a break, like 4 centuries of composure finally giving way. "That has to mean something," she continued. "It means everything," he managed, his voice rough with an emotion he'd been holding back for 2 months. "It means more than you can possibly know." "I want to know," she said. "I want to know everything. No more lies. No more secrets. No more deciding what I can handle. You tell me the truth. All of it. Including the parts that make you look bad. Especially those parts." A pause. And then her voice came harder, a line drawn in sand. "And if this ever happens again, if I forget again, you don't lie. You sit by my bed, you take my hand, and you tell me exactly who you are to me, immediately. You let me make my own choices, even the ones that scare you. Promise me." "I promise," he said, and the word carried the weight of a vow that could outlast centuries. "Iris, I will spend forever making sure you are never hurt because of me again, but I will do it with you, Not for you. I will never make that choice for you again." "Good," she said softly. "When can you come over?" "I'm on my way." When she opened the door, the air between them was thick with 2 months of silence and 2 years of a lost history. He didn't try to touch her. He just stood on her threshold, his eyes drinking her in. She looked tired, but she was steady. The fear was gone from her expression, replaced by a wary, hard-won resolve. She stepped back, letting him in. He walked into the living room where their love had been dismantled and now waited to be rebuilt. "Where do we start?" she asked, her arms crossed over her chest. He didn't start with the politics, the enemies, or the danger. He started with himself. He sat on the edge of her sofa and told her not what he was, but how it felt. "I don't get cold," he said, his voice low and steady. "My body runs at the temperature of the air around it. My heart doesn't beat. I don't need to breathe, though I do it out of habit. It helps people feel more at ease." So the poor circulation thing was a lie. One of roughly 7,000 I told you in the space of 3 weeks. 7,000 seems conservative, she said, and the corner of his mouth twitched a fraction of a smile in the middle of a confession. She listened as he unraveled the practical, physical realities of his existence. His senses, how he could hear her heart from across the city, how the scent of her emotions was as legible to him as text on a page, how the darkness was not dark to him at all. "And there is a hunger," he said, looking at his hands. "It's a physical need, not a metaphor. It's for blood." She nodded slowly, as if confirming something she had already half known. "Human blood?" "Yes. There are ways to manage it. Blood banks, willing donors. I have never taken a life, Iris. I drew that line for myself centuries ago." "The not eating," she said. "At restaurants, I thought you were an intermittent faster with a gastric condition. I was pushing carbonara around a plate and hoping you wouldn't notice." I noticed immediately. The waiter noticed. I'm fairly certain the couple at the next table noticed. "For the record, you're a terrible actor. The pasta thing was embarrassing to witness. In my defense, I haven't eaten food since the 17th century. I've forgotten what convincing looks like." "It looks like chewing, Caden, and swallowing. 2 things humans do with food. I'll make a note." She almost smiled. Almost. He could see it there, fighting against the anger and the hurt, and the fact that humor could coexist with everything else she was feeling gave him a thread of hope so thin it could have been imagined. He told her how he was changed in a Venetian alley in the winter of 1631 by a creature who offered him a choice that was not really a choice at all. She asked questions throughout, the way a researcher would. When he said he was turned, she wanted to know what turned meant physically. When he described the hunger, she wanted to know how it worked. Was it constant? Did it fluctuate? What happened if he ignored it? "You get dangerous," he said, simply. "More dangerous than a man who scared 2 armed strangers into running by standing still?" "Considerably." She processed this. "And the court. Explain the court." He described the hierarchy, the old blood and the new, the territories carved out of cities and countrysides, the covenant law that bound them, the balance of power that depended on alliances that were older than most nations. She listened with the focused attention of a woman who was mentally building a footnoted bibliography. "So it's basically corporate politics," she said, "but everyone's immortal and the hostile takeovers are literal." "That is distressingly accurate." "And the margin notes in the Venetian court records," she said. "You wrote, 'I was there because you actually were.'" "I was the ambassador's interpreter," he said, "and he was recalled in March, not April. The book is wrong." When he finished, the room was quiet. He had given her every weapon she needed to destroy him. He waited for her judgment. She was quiet for a long time. Then she uncrossed her arms and walked toward him. She stopped just before him and slowly, tentatively, reached out her hand. She didn't touch his face or his arm. She placed her palm flat against his chest, right over the place where his heart should have been beating. There was nothing. Just stillness. Just the cool of his skin through the thin fabric of his shirt. She looked up, her eyes meeting his. He could see the fear there, the awe, the confusion. But he also saw something else: acceptance, hard-earned and deliberate, nothing like surrender. "Okay," she whispered. It was the single most beautiful word he had ever heard in any of his 6 languages. The weeks that followed were a slow, careful dance of rebuilding. Trust, Caden learned, was not a structure that could be reassembled from its old parts. It had to be grown from the ground up, a slow, tender shoot in the rubble of his lies. He let her set the pace. Some nights they just talked. She wanted to know the small details of his life, the real ones. What was his favorite decade? The 1920s, for the music. The worst? The 1870s, for the fashion. Who was the first person he'd ever loved and lost to time? A librarian in Prague named Anya, whose great-great-granddaughter he'd once anonymously helped get into medical school. "That's either the sweetest or the creepiest thing I've ever heard," Iris said, "and I genuinely cannot decide which." "It's both," he admitted. "Immortality makes everything both." She met KL properly on a Thursday evening. Caden had warned her, "He's direct," which turned out to be the understatement of several centuries. KL arrived at the apartment, saw Iris sitting on the couch with a cup of tea and a stack of research papers, and stopped in the doorway with the expression of a man who had predicted a catastrophe and was now watching it unfold exactly as forecast. "So," Kale said, settling into an armchair with the air of someone who had been judging people's life choices since before the invention of the printing press, "you're the reason my king spent 2 months repainting rooms at 3 in the morning. He repainted rooms? The guest bedroom. Twice. 2 different shades of gray that were, to the immortal eye, absolutely identical." Kale glanced at Caden, who was standing in the kitchen doorway, looking like he very much wished the floor would open and consume him. He also reorganized the library by publication date, then by author, then by spine color. "It was the most pathetic thing I've witnessed in 500 years, and I watched the fall of Constantinople." "Kale," Caden said. She asked for honesty. "I'm providing it." Kale turned back to Iris. "You have questions. I can tell because you have the look of a scholar who has been given incomplete primary sources. Ask." Iris studied him for a moment. "How old are you?" 512. Give or take. Record keeping in the 15th century was not what it is today. "And you've been with Caden for 380 years. I found him in a gutter in Amsterdam, freshly turned and utterly useless. I taught him everything he knows about being what we are, which means every mistake he makes is technically my fault." He paused, "Including this one." "You mean me?" "I mean the lying. You, specifically, are the best decision he's ever made, and I say that as someone who disagrees with him on nearly everything." KL's voice carried something almost gentle beneath the acidity. "He was a lonely, angry creature for centuries before you. You made him remember what it felt like to care whether tomorrow came. That's not nothing." Iris looked at Caden, who was still standing in the kitchen doorway, his expression raw and unguarded. "He's also a fool," Kale added, "but that's a separate conversation." One evening, Caden took her to an observatory on the hills overlooking the city, a relic from the turn of the 20th century that he owned and kept running for a handful of university students and aging astronomers. They stood beneath the massive, open dome, the night sky a spray of diamonds above them. "This is where I come when the city is too loud," he said. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "The woman who taught me about the stars was turned in the 15th century, he said softly. "She believed that if you watched them long enough, you could see the universe breathing. A single slow breath that takes 1 billion years. That's what time feels like to me, most of the time." "And the rest of the time?" He looked at her, his eyes reflecting starlight. "The rest of the time, it feels like the seconds I have with you, ticking away far too fast." She stepped closer, into his space, and reached up to touch his face. Her hand was warm against his cold skin. He closed his eyes, savoring the contact, the simple, profound intimacy of being touched by someone who knew exactly what he was and chose to stay. A week later, he brought the blue velvet box to her apartment. He didn't open it. He set it on the coffee table between them, a silent offering. "Its history is not as long as mine," he said quietly, The stone is from a mine in Kashmir that was exhausted 200 years ago. The man who cut it was the finest in Antwerp. I designed the setting myself. It waited in a vault for over a century because I never found the hand it was meant for. He looked at her. Until I met you. The first time. He pushed it gently across the table. It is a symbol of a promise I made, and a promise I broke by lying to you. It's yours. When you're ready, if you're ever ready, there is no expectation. Iris looked at the box, then at him, the man who had lied to protect her, the king who had dismantled his enemy for her, the ancient being who was learning to be honest for her. She opened the box. The sapphire glowed in the lamplight, a deep, knowing blue. She remembered the feeling of it on her finger, the phantom sensation of rightness. A memory of a memory, a ghost of a promise. Slowly, she lifted the ring from its velvet bed. He watched, his stillness absolute, his entire being focused on her. She held it in her palm, the cool metal a familiar weight. She didn't put it on her left hand. Not yet. Instead, she took his hand, the one that was always so cold, and turned it over. She slid the ring onto his smallest finger. It was too small, of course, stopping at the knuckle. A ridiculous, imperfect fit. We start new, she said, her voice firm. No more ghosts, no more past promises. We build our own. She looked up at him, her whiskey brown eyes clear and full of a love that was stronger than memory, stronger than lies. Promise me, Caden, a new promise. And this time, when I'm ready to talk about the turning, it'll be because I chose it with my eyes open. Not because a version of me I can't remember made the decision for me. He looked down at the ring, perched absurdly on his finger, a symbol not of a reclaimed past but of a chosen future. A smile touched his lips, a real one, full of a light she had never seen there before. He curled his fingers around the ring and brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles. I promise, Iris, he said, his voice thick with 400 years of loneliness finally reaching shore. Forever, this time we'll get it right.